In this video, we're going to go through a couple of examples of quadratic applications. And in the first example, it says a person has a garden that has a length that is 9 feet longer than the width. So this is important information right here, so we can set the problem up. I'm going to use this to draw my picture. Okay, we're going to set up a quadratic equation, and we're going to use that quadratic equation to find the dimensions of the garden. And it gives us also that the area is 190 feet squared. So here's a picture that represents our garden. I'm going to call the width x, and I'm going to call the length x plus 9 because the problem tells me that the length is 9 feet longer than the width. So whatever the width is, I'm going to add 9 to get the length. So when I go ahead and set up my quadratic equation and I go to solve for x, that's going to give me my width. So for example, if my x, I'm just making up a number here for an example, if my x comes out to be 5 feet, then I know that's my width, and my length would have to be 14 feet because I add 9 to that. Okay, so to set up our equation, since they give us the area, we can use that. Okay. We know that the area of a rectangle is length times width. Okay, and in this case, my length is x plus 9, and my width is x, and my area is 190 feet squared. So I'm going to multiply through and distribute, so I'm going to get x squared plus 9x. And now we have our quadratic equation. So what we're going to do is we're going to use one of our methods for solving quadratics to solve this equation. I know it's a quadratic because it's an x squared equation. That's my degree is 2. Okay, now we have multiple methods to solve a quadratic. We have factoring, but factoring always doesn't work, but it's usually the easiest way to do it. Then if factoring doesn't work, then we can resort to one of the other methods like quadratic formula or complete the square or square root property. I'm going to try factoring first because that's my preference. So in order to factor, we have to set everything equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 190 from both sides. So I want something that will multiply to give me negative 190, but add to give me plus 9. So how about we use plus 19 and a minus 10. When I multiply plus 19 and a negative 10, that gives me negative 190, but when I add that, it gives me a positive 9. Now, if you don't like factoring, you can use quadratic formula or complete the square or some other method that we talked about. Once we have it factored, then we can set up our little mini equations and say x plus 19 is equal to 0. So x could be negative 19. Or I could say x minus 10 is equal to 0, which means x could be equal to 10. Now, if we were looking at just the quadratic equation x squared plus 9x minus 190 without the context of this problem, and I asked you to solve it, you would definitely tell me the answers are negative 19 or 10. But because we're doing this in the context of a problem where we're talking about x being a length, we never use negative lengths. So I'm going to cross this out as a possible answer. And I'm just going to say that my only answer in this particular case, because we're doing it in the context of length, our only answer is x is 10. So I can say that my width is 10 feet, because that's my x. X is 10, which represented my width, which means my length has to be 19 feet because my length was 9 feet longer. Okay, in the next example, we're going to talk about quadratics in the context of business. And in this problem, it gives us a cost function for a company. And it gives us a revenue function. So it says X is the production level. We want to set up a quadratic equation to find two values of X that will create a profit of $300. Now remember that profit is going to be however much money you take in, which is your revenue, and you're going to subtract off any costs that you have. And whatever's left over when you subtract off the cost, that's going to be your profit, how much money you're going to make. Okay, so we're going to take the revenue function, which is given as 110x minus the 0.5x squared, and we're going to subtract the cost function. Now remember, you're subtracting an entire function, so either put parentheses around it because you're subtracting the entire function, or just remember right up front to distribute your negative sign. So when I subtract my cost function, that's going to be 70x plus 300. And the question is asking us to set up a function so that the profit is 300. So I'm going to set my profit equal to 300 over here. So after we clean this up a little bit, I have 110x minus 0.5x squared. And then that's going to give me a minus 70x. And then a minus 300. I am going to combine like terms. So I have 110x and I'm subtracting a 70x. So that gives me a 40x. And then I have a minus 0.5x squared and a minus 300. Now because I'm solving a quadratic, I'm going to try factoring first. We'll see if that works. But in order to do that, I need to make it so that I have 0 on one side and everything else on the other. So I'm going to subtract 300 from both sides, which means I'm going to have, and then if I rewrite this in descending order, I'm going to put my x squared first. So I have 0.5x squared, and then I have a plus 40x and a minus 600. Whoops, I forgot my negative. Okay, now I want to, if I'm going to try to factor this, I want to get rid of that negative 0.5 in the front. I'm going to divide the whole equation by negative 0.5 to see if I can make this a little bit easier. Okay, so 0 divided by negative 0.5 is still 0. Negative 0.5 divided by negative 0.5 is 1, and I'm left with just x squared. If I take 40 divided by negative 0.5, I'm going to get a negative 80. And that gives me x. And then if I take 600 divided by 0.5, that's going to give me a 1200, which would be positive because I have a negative divided by a negative. Okay, now if I factor this, it's a little bit easier without that negative 0.5 in the front. Let's see, I want something to multiply to give me 1200, but to add to give me a minus 80. So let's do minus 20 and minus 60. If I take negative 20 and negative 60 and multiply them together, that gives me a positive 1200. And then if I add them, I get a negative 80. So now I can set up my two mini equations and say x minus 20 is 0 and x minus 60 is equal to 0. So my two values of x are going to be 20 and 60, which are going to be the two production levels. That's what we want. That's what I asked for, the two production levels that will give us a profit of $300. Now, you don't have to do this by factoring. That's just my preference. If you would like to use the quadratic formula or another method, you're more than welcome to do that. You should still get the same answer, though. And then if you do this on a test, just make sure that you do this algebraically, like using the quadratic formula or the complete the square, the factoring, something that I can see your steps out. And then if you want to use the calculator method to check your answer, that is totally fine. But on the test, I want to see your steps written out.